Imagine a world where your identity disappears the moment you tie on a mask, where duchesses dance with thieves, where forbidden romances bloom in shadowed corners, and where a single night could end in fortune, ruin, or murder. Welcome, dear listeners, to the 18th century masquerade balls, the most scandalous, dangerous, and intoxicating events in history. Picture this. It's London, 1740. The Haymarket Opera House blazes with 1,000 candles. Through its doors pour aristocrats in silk and satin, their faces hidden behind jeweled masks. But look closer. That countess might be a courtesan. That gentleman could be a pickpocket. And that couple disappearing into the garden, they're certainly not married to each other. And this wasn't a rare occurrence. In London alone, massive masquerade balls were hosted almost every week. This wasn't an occasional indulgence. It was an obsession that consumed high society. These were extravagant nighttime spectacles that took over the ballrooms, opera houses, and palace gardens of Europe's greatest cities. London, Venice, Paris, Vienna. Each became a stage for the most elaborate game of deception ever played. But these weren't just parties. They were powder kegs of scandal, crime, and forbidden desire, where the rigid class system of the 1700s melted away like wax in candlelight, and the ruling classes were terrified. The mask changed everything. Behind that layer of silk, leather, or porcelain, you could be anyone, do anything. The servant girl could mock a duke to his face. The merchant's wife could reject a prince's advances. The political radical could whisper sedition without fear. One pamphlet of the era warned, "A mask hides not the face, but the conscience." For women especially, masquerades offered something revolutionary: temporary freedom. Without chaperones watching their every move, women could choose their own partners, move through crowds unchaperoned, engage in conversations usually forbidden to them. They could cross class boundaries that, by daylight, were as solid as prison walls. Young people could flirt with each other without their parents knowing where they were or who they were talking to. The disguises made surveillance impossible, and this terrified men in power. But anonymity cut both ways. Thieves wore masks and blended into crowds of hundreds. Pickpockets worked the packed ballrooms like a harvest. Prostitutes disguised themselves as noble women, their true identities hidden beneath silk and jewels, a deception that infuriated the aristocracy. And some used the cover of masks for darker purposes still: assault, abduction, even murder. 3 cities dominated the masquerade world, each with its own dark reputation. Venice, the undisputed capital. Venice was the birthplace of the mask. During Carnival season, Venetians wore masks for months at a time. The line between reality and performance dissolved completely. The great seducer Casanova used masquerades to deceive husbands, seduce women, and escape arrest. Gambling dens operated openly behind masked anonymity. Secret societies flourished in the shadows. The situation became so extreme that Venice passed laws banning masks inside churches, because people were using them to commit sins, even in sacred spaces. London, theatre of scandal. London's masquerades were dominated by one man, John James Heidegger, the king of masquerades, a Swiss impresario who filled the Haymarket Opera House with what moralists called sinks of debauchery and corruption. Here, nobles danced alongside actors, courtesans mingled with royalty. Sometimes even members of the royal family attended, their identities supposedly secret beneath their masks. In 1749, riots erupted when one particularly infamous masquerade was accused of satanic influence. Mobs gathered, demanding these gateways to hell be shut down forever. Paris royal decadence. At the Opera de Paris, masquerades became showcases of lavish excess. King Louis XV himself attended in disguise, dancing among his subjects, his identity theoretically hidden. Behind the anonymity of masks, court members conducted affairs, made political alliances, and played dangerous games of power. The masks themselves spoke a language all their own. The bauta was Venice's signature, a stark white mask paired with a black cloak and tricorn hat. Worn by both men and women, it was the ultimate symbol of anonymous power. The colombina was the flirt's choice, a half mask, often jeweled, that revealed just enough of the face to entice while concealing identity. The moretta was perhaps the strangest, a black velvet mask held in place by biting a button on the inside. Women who wore it couldn't speak, creating an aura of mysterious, erotic silence. The domino was the simplest, just a hooded cloak and basic mask, perfect for those who wanted to hide completely. Each mask told a story. Each promised a different kind of night. But masks were only the beginning. The costumes themselves were performances. Some attendees spent fortunes on elaborate ensembles, then covered their faces with nothing more than a simple visor, letting the costume do all the talking. Others dressed in what they called Oriental styles, Turkish robes, elaborate turbans, feathered cloaks, showing off both their wealth and their worldly knowledge. These costumes weren't just disguises. They were statements of sophistication, artistic taste, and cultural awareness. Every outfit was a story, a performance, a carefully crafted lie. But what actually happened at these events? What made them so dangerous, so scandalous, that religious leaders called them the devil's playground? Secret affairs. Married nobles met lovers without consequence. Diaries from the era speak of masked embraces, stolen kisses, and clandestine visits after the ball. The anonymity was perfect. Even if you stood 3 feet from your own spouse, neither of you would know. Scandalous spectacle. And then there were those who used masquerades to push boundaries in ways that shocked even the jaded aristocracy. Elizabeth Chudleigh, later the Duchess of Kingston, became infamous for attending a masquerade completely topless, dressed, she claimed, as a Greek goddess. Because it was historical costume, she argued it was perfectly acceptable. The women at the ball were horrified, filling their diaries and letters with scandalized commentary. The men, according to those same sources, were thoroughly entertained. It was the kind of calculated provocation that could only happen behind a mask. Class deception. Lower-class sex workers weren't the only ones exploiting anonymity. Mistresses of dukes and lords openly accompanied their patrons to these balls, hidden behind masks and fine silk. It was deeply offensive to many attendees, but unless you physically unmasked someone, you couldn't accuse them of anything, and doing so would cause a scandal of its own. The mask was the ultimate shield. Political espionage ambassadors and spies used masquerades as cover for illegal activities. They could ask illicit questions, recruit informants, and spread propaganda while surrounded by witnesses who could identify no one. Gambling and ruin. Entire fortunes evaporated in a single night. Princes, duchesses, and wealthy merchants wagered their estates on cards and dice. The anonymity meant there was no shame until morning, and by then, it was too late. Crime in the shadows, pickpockets, worked the crowds systematically. Assaults happened in secluded corners and gardens. One Venetian court record describes a masked man killing another during Carnival and escaping because everyone wore the same clothes. The murderer simply vanished into a sea of identical masks. Forbidden identity men dressed as women, women dressed as men. In many cities, this was illegal, but at masquerades, it was common. For one night, even gender could be a costume, another layer of disguise. Religious leaders were apoplectic. They called masquerades gateways to hell, dens of iniquity, the devil's playground, theatres of vice, where women forget virtue and men forget honour. London attempted to ban them in 1724, 1744, and 1749. Each time, the laws failed. The wealthy simply ignored them, and the events continued. The upper classes were addicted to the freedom, the danger, the thrill of a world where consequences seemed to vanish with the dawn. By the late 1700s, the great age of masquerades was ending. Rising moral conservatism, religious pressure, and political revolutions, including the French Revolution, changed the social landscape completely. Crime had become too common, the scandals too public, and as social surveillance became stricter, the freedom of the mask became a liability rather than a luxury. Small masquerades continued into the Victorian era, but they were tame affairs, costume parties, not social powder kegs. The decadent, dangerous, intoxicating masquerades of the 1700s were gone forever. The masquerade balls of the 18th century existed at a unique moment in history, when the old world was dying, but the new one hadn't yet been born. For an hour, an evening, a single night, people could be free. They could push boundaries, break rules, seduce strangers, gamble fortunes, become someone else entirely. And then, as dawn broke, they would remove their masks and return to their boring, respectable, upper-class lives until next week's ball.